everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Storytelling Basics for Nonprofits. My name is Jenny Taylor, and I'm the Community Manager here at GuideStar. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we begin. First of all, we're going to be live tweeting during today's presentation using the hashtag StorytellingNPO. So please join the conversation on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you guys. Secondly, we are happy to take questions from all of you during the presentation. The Q&A is actually at the end of the presentation, but you can submit your questions at any time. To submit a question, you can use the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If we don't get to all of your questions before our time is up today, we'll post more of the answers on the GuideStar blog at trust.guidestar.org soon. And finally, we will send all of you an email with a link to the presentation and today's recording in a few days. I'm now happy to introduce Vanessa Chase. Vanessa is a fundraising and communication strategist and founder of the StorytellingNonprofit.com, which helps nonprofits connect in more meaningful ways with donors through stories and stewardship. She works with several nationally recognized nonprofits and is an internationally recognized speaker. Welcome, Vanessa, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's on the webinar today. I'm delighted to be here, and there are well over 300 people joining us, which is wonderful. And I'd love to start us off by getting to know all of you. So if you have a minute, I would love for you to respond in the chat box and tell us what's your role at your nonprofit and what are you hoping to learn during today's webinar. I always think it's a great opportunity to get to know everyone and see who's joining us today. So again, you can just type in your answers in the chat box just down at the bottom right-hand corner on your screen. So I see a couple people who are responding already, people who are directors of development, which is great, program managers, grant managers, wonderful. So a whole variety of people on our call today. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, so much for responding. A couple of board members, too. This is great. I'm so glad you all can join us, and I really hope you get a lot out of today's webinar. Great. So I see a couple people have said they're looking forward to learning how to change their organizational culture around storytelling, which is a really great thing to think about. A few people are talking about learning ways to share their stories through new mediums, which is great as well. There are lots of ways to be able to share your stories. And it kind of depends a little bit about where your audience is that you're trying to reach. So we'll definitely be talking about that as well. All right, so thank you everyone so much. I'm really grateful that you've all participated in the chat, and we'll do a couple more of these throughout the webinar as well. So a lot of you mentioned some great things that you're looking forward to learning, which is awesome, and I'm really happy about that. But before we dive into more of the information that I want to share with you today, I want to kick us off with a bit of story time, which seems appropriate given what we're talking about today. So I want to tell you a bit about why I believe storytelling is the best fundraising and communications tool at our disposal. So prior to my consulting work, I used to be a development officer at a social service organization here in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is where I live. And I would frequently call up donors who had made gifts to say thank you to them, to tell them a bit more about the work that we were doing. And so often I would be on the phone with people or I would be out at a donor meeting, and these calls would just be received with a radio silence. I would tell them something that I thought was compelling, but they wouldn't really have much of a reaction to it. So perhaps some of you have experienced this before if you've been out meeting donors, or maybe you sent out some sort of communication and you didn't really get much of a response, and you just kind of feel like no one's really engaged with what you're doing. It's just the worst feeling, right? I'm sure some of you can relate to that. So after one too many conversations like that I had at that organization, I decided that there was maybe a larger problem that needed to be addressed in the kind of work that we were doing. And that was that, we as an organization, like many nonprofits in our sector, we're not great at communicating with our donors. And specifically, we weren't really great at communicating the impact around our donors' gifts. And because they weren't communicating impact particularly well, we were having a hard time getting donors engaged with us. And that became kind of a self-perpetuating cycle that lasted all too long. But we did change how we were doing things, and I want to share a bit of a case study about that with you all. So during my time there, over the course of 2 years, we really changed how we were communicating with donors, and it all started with stories. It came with some pretty outstanding results, too. We managed to increase our overall revenue by $150,000 in the second year. We identified over 200 major gift prospects, and we had a ton of improvements to our donor relations. And that was simply because we became more open to sharing with our donors in a much more authentic way, because we had lots of stories to tell them and we were excited to share them with them. We even had one specific direct mail appeal that was entirely a story, and it raised over $70,000 in that appeal, which was pretty fantastic. So this is just one of many case study results that I have about the power of storytelling, which really makes me believe that it's such a fantastic tool. So I hope with all that in mind, I want to share with you what I've learned over the last couple of years about nonprofit storytelling through my work, and also work with the research that I've been doing around storytelling with a number of organizations. And today we're going to really cover the basics. And so I'll be talking about storytelling in the context of fundraising, and we can also talk about what that means for communications with foundations or other grant-making entities that you might be receiving money from. We'll also talk about how to create a strategy for storytelling as well. So how can we really make the most of our stories that we have? How can we complement the fundraising and communications that we're doing to really leverage our efforts overall? We'll also look at a 5-step process for collecting and developing stories. And we'll wrap up by talking about some of the benefits that come with engaging your community. So I just see a couple of people have said that I need to speak a little bit louder, so I hope that I am. And if I'm not, please let me know, and I will do my best to talk louder. Also, perhaps if you're on a computer, maybe just adjust your volume a little bit. That might help as well. All right, so let's carry on here, and let's talk a little bit more about storytelling and what it even is. So I like to think about storytelling as the process of combining facts and narrative in order to communicate a message and an emotion to a target audience. So this is a definition that I've developed over the last couple of years, thinking about storytelling and all of the possibilities for it. So this is a bit of a meaty definition, and I'll break it down a little bit more for you. So combining facts and narrative, traditionally we think of storytelling as just being someone's narrative, perhaps kind of like a monologue. Or maybe you think about Disney stories or fairy tales, things like that are very traditional stories. But because we're using stories for strategic purposes here, be it in grants, in newsletters with donors, it's really more than just that narrative. So we need to strategically add in relevant facts and perhaps even statistics that really complement that narrative and help build a case for support for our organization. So I also mentioned strategic purposes, and this really speaks to the second part of this definition, which is all about communicating a message and emotion to a target audience. Now, I think this is a really important thing to talk about because, we're not telling a story just for the sake of telling a story. We're telling a story because we want to connect people to our organization's work. We want to inspire them to care and ensure that they feel like they've been a part of something really meaningful. Or if they haven't donated before, that they can be a part of something really meaningful. So I always find that that's a really important piece to keep in mind, because so often what I see with nonprofit stories is that they're told just kind of for the sake of storytelling, because it seems to be this trendy thing that we're supposed to be doing. And a lot of folks really miss out on the opportunity to incorporate some really important facts and information that can, again, help build that case for support through storytelling. Now, just for a second here, I want to consider, what happens when you don't tell stories. So I told you earlier about a problem that perplexed me as a fundraiser at an organization I used to work for. But there's a lot of other things we can consider as well. So if you're not telling stories, a lot of times you're not able to connect in an impactful way with your donors. That means you're not really emotionally meeting them where they're at. And when that happens, when donors aren't able to kind of make that emotional connection, going beyond the logical facts that they see, they aren't always able to understand the deeper implications of your work. They aren't able to understand, the bigger picture that they're a part of. And oftentimes what happens as a result of this is that they stop caring. They become apathetic towards our causes, which is exactly what we don't want, because when people feel unconnected, they start to sever ties with us. And that's where we run into issues around donor retention rates and high attrition rates over time. So this is what happens, I think, with a lot of nonprofit organizations. And, the reason why this happens so often is that, we're not always aware of our donors' knowledge levels. So I want to talk about that here as well. So I really think this downhill process begins really quite simply with what I like to call the donor knowledge gap. So your donors, be it individuals, corporations, foundations, they're not at your organization 5 days a week seeing the work in action, nor do they have the benefit of really having such in-depth knowledge about the cause like you might. And this is really where the divide between your donor and your organization can start to happen. It's a divide that you really have to be able to fill or bridge in order to be able to persuade and effectively communicate with your donors. So as you can see there on the screen, on the left side, we have our donors and the organization over on the right side. And, when I think about this, oftentimes when I'm going through the process of writing a story or writing an appeal letter, it's really helpful to think about, what is the context that my donor exists in? What information do they know about my organization? What's their daily life like? And how can I connect the pieces of our work to what's relevant to them in the day-to-day? So one of the ways that we can do this really effectively is through stories. They're a great tool that we have at our disposal, and when we start to use more of them to bridge this gap between our donors and our organization, we can really start to deepen their knowledge and also deepen their empathy for the cause, which, in effect represents an overall growth in the relationship that the donor has with your organization. So stories really help to bridge this gap in two pretty important ways that I'll talk about here for just a second. So the first is that they provide context for understanding the information that's being communicated. And this context really arises through the character of your story and their emotional experience of working through a specific conflict. And we're going to talk about that a lot more here in a few minutes. And the second is that they emotionally connect with your donors. They emotionally connect your donors to the cause that they're supporting. And the emotional connection is really what resonates and reverberates with your donors' hearts and their minds. And this is what makes your organization truly memorable. So together, I really find that these benefits of telling stories to connect our audiences is really what helps to retain our donors and also build really meaningful relationships, which is ultimately what we want to do. And if you're a program staff person on the line today with us, stories also have great implications for the clients that we work with too. We want clients to feel comfortable, to feel confident coming to our organization for support, for help, whatever it might be that they're looking for. And, when we can tell them stories about other people who have gone through a program, who have accessed the service, we can help build their trust in our ability to help them in a similar situation, which is a really powerful thing to be able to do. Now, I think in many cases as well, it's really just about telling stories to people. It's about just being able to connect those dots for them. And we're going to talk about that here in the next portion of the webinar. We're going to talk about how to craft our stories in 5 steps, which I hope will be really helpful information for you. But I just wanted to pause here for a second. Jenny, do we have any questions so far that I can answer for people?
Hi, Vanessa. The only one that I've seen so far is just talking about balancing between storytelling and big data. I'm not sure if you're going to get to that at some point or if that's something to follow up with afterwards.
I wasn't planning on talking about that today, but I can take a stab at that question quickly, and then we can move forward into the next part. So
perfect.
That's a really great question. So I earlier mentioned that storytelling is kind of this blending of facts and narrative and also data. So there's, of course, many ways to tell stories. And one of the ways that you can tell a story, kind of in format and also in presentation, is through data. So things like infographics, where you use your data to tell a story about how a program has been executed, how you've helped solve a problem in the community. And that's a really great, very powerful way to be able to contextualize information for people when they can see the big picture all at once. And the other way that you can really use data as well in your storytelling is to include it in your stories, in the narrative portion of things. At the end of the story that you've told about one individual, which I like to think of as kind of talking about the kind of micro level of the story. So you're focusing on one person, one problem that they've had, and you're telling that specific story. Now, what can be really powerful at the end of that is if you kind of zoom out a bit to tell the macro version of that story, which is that there's more than just this one person with this one problem. Maybe there's 200 people with this same problem, or maybe there's thousands of people with that problem. And you can start to use data to support the fact that there is a greater need in the community beyond this one person's story, which hopefully was compelling to your reader. And by the end of it, they see that need and they're like, wow, I want to be a part of this and I want to be able to help more people who are going through something like this. So I hope that answers the question a little bit more. I see a couple of questions in the chat too, and I can answer those quickly before we go on. So Lisa wants to know if I can give an example of providing context to our donors. So this is a great question, which I talked about in kind of helping understand your donors' context and building context for them. So for instance, I work with an organization in the crisis center, and quite often we talk about the fact that sexual assault is on the rise in the community, and that we get a certain number of calls every year from women in the community who need support. Annually, it's something like 3,000 phone calls, and we're just one organization. But for a long time, as an organization, they would just talk about the number of calls that they received. That there was a huge volume of calls, that we received 3,000 every year. And that's a significant number. That's certainly not something to look away from. But for a lot of people that we talk to, and that board members would go out and talk to, well, they would think, well, 3,000, like, what does that mean in the context of our community problem? And so what we had to do as an organization was do some more research and do some more digging so that we could tell the bigger story beyond just ourselves. So the fact that, we are one of 8 women's rape crisis centers in Vancouver, and we alone receive 3,000 calls a year. Combined together, all the organizations receive a significant number more. And, that the Vancouver Police Department estimates that only 10% of sexual assaults are reported every year. So we started to tell this larger story about the fact that women live in silence, they live in fear, and we found a number of women who we'd helped through counseling talk about their stories and why it took them a long time to seek out help and support, and really what we could do as a community through anti-violence advocacy work to help empower women and to come forward. So I hope that gives you kind of a bit of an example of creating context, Lisa, and we can come back to that at the end too, and I can always answer that after the webinar as well. So I see just one other question here. Let's see, Christine wants to know, our organization assists the disabled, and many of their stories need to be kept confidential. How can we talk about this without breaching trust or potentially embarrassing them? That's a really great question, Christine, and one I get asked quite often. This is a big consideration for a lot of organizations that are dealing with sensitive issues and issues around confidentiality. There are a number of ways to talk about this, and I'll talk about this a bit more in the next section of the webinar. But one thing, that I can suggest to you is that you can tell their story through the eyes of a staff person. So if there's a programs person who has worked with that individual, you can get them to talk about someone who they've worked with and tell that story. You can also do things to help improve your client's comfort level around sharing stories. So really giving them the power to, approve the narrative at the end, to say that they're okay with how they're represented in that story. And really helping them find the power in the experience of sharing that story. So telling them, that, or showing them rather, that, donors community members are really appreciative of hearing these stories, and that there's a great power in that, and that they can be a part of that as well. So I'll come back to that in just a little bit here as well. So, but thank you everyone so much for your questions so far. This was great, and we'll carry on into the next portion, and of course I'll definitely be answering some more questions here at the end as well. So as I mentioned, the rest of the time here this morning, we're going to talk about kind of the 5 keys to storytelling, which I like to think of as kind of being able to collect, develop, and share your story. And this is the same process that I use with a number of my clients, and also when I teach workshops. And as we go through this process, I will also give you a number of activities that you can test out and use to help yourself implement some of these steps as well. So let's start with the first one here, which is defining your goal and your core message. So like pretty much any other fundraising and communications endeavor, we have to have a strategy that drives our efforts forward. You know, in other words, what's going to keep us on the straight and narrow to achieving our goals? And in this respect, I think storytelling is really no different. If we want to be effective, we, as I said earlier, cannot tell a story just for the sake of telling a story. And so that's why I really recommend starting with kind of the end in mind, where we identify a goal and also identify a core message that we want to communicate through that story. So what I like to do is start by asking myself this question: what is the end goal of telling this story? And oftentimes this relates to the context that you're telling the story in. So perhaps it's for fundraising, maybe it's for marketing or awareness, maybe it's for promoting a program that you're marketing to a larger community. Just think about what you want people to do as a result of this storytelling, or the story that they're reading. I sometimes will think about it as in 3 questions. So when someone sits down and reads a story in an email or a story on our website, the first question I think of is, what do I want them to think after they've read this story? The next one is, what do I want them to feel after they've read that story? So what emotions do I want for them to come up? And the last one is, what do I want them to do as a result of reading the story? So again, this gets to that question that's up there on the screen, which is, what is the end goal of the story? And this is a really powerful way to really think through some of your strategy about how do you get someone to take that action? How do you get them to answer your call to action and to join your organization in whatever it is you might be doing? And then on the other side of that coin is your core message. So in relation to your goal that you set, there's a really important question to think about, which is, what is the overarching message that you want to convey? And I'll give you a bit of a hint for this. Quite often the answer to this question is the reason why someone would answer the call to action. And this is particularly true if it's a fundraising story or a donor relations story, that sort of thing. And it might be related to, how you're trying to move your relationship forward. So if you are communicating to potential program participants, what do you want them to do after they've read the story? Do you want them to inquire more to find out about that program? Do you want them to sign up for it? What is that action that you want them to do? And what message can help compel them forward? So what is that one thing you want them to think that will help catalyze their action? So again, just a way to think about how you can structure your goal and your core message for the story that you want to tell. So to give you an example of this, I thought I'd share this one from the University of Toronto. This is from one of their recent campaigns. It's the story of Holly, Zoe, and Katia. And I put the website URL up here, so you're welcome to go check out the full story, although it's not much longer than what you can see here on the screen. So the gist of this, for those of you who are just on the phone and not checking out the slides, is that this is a story of 3 young girls who were between ages 10 and 7. And they had seen lots of stories about H1N1 outbreaks in the Toronto area, probably about a year or 2 ago. And they decided that they wanted to do something so that it wouldn't spread further and that there would be some sort of cure for H1N1. And they decided to put together a lemonade stand to raise money, and they raised $25.48. And it's a really charming, very cute story. There's a wonderful picture of the 3 girls together. and talking about what they've done. Their grandfather was a U of T alumni, which is how they ended up supporting a research fund there. So when I think about the goal of this story, so why would they be telling this story to someone who's visiting their website? It's really about encouraging giving. So their goal is that they want someone to read this and click through and make a gift, either to the research fund or maybe to something else. The message, I think, which is really interesting in this story, is that anyone can make a difference no matter what size gift they make. So often at big universities, hospital foundations, we see a lot of stories about major donors, people who have given 6- and 7-figure gifts. And, we don't often see stories about, the everyday donor, the smaller annual level donors. So I think it's really powerful that they've kind of created that inclusive community where they're sharing stories about other types of donors and helping them kind of see that it's possible and important for other folks to make donations as well. All right, so moving along here into the second step of this process, I want to talk about getting to know your audience better, which is a really pertinent step in storytelling. We'll start by really overturning this common assumption that is everyone in the whole wide world will love your work and will want to donate or will want to be engaged with it. Now, I don't want to come across as being harsh in this, but it's a really faulty assumption to make, and it's one that can be really detrimental and hold you back in whatever it is you're trying to achieve. It is far more effective for us to really narrowly talk to a narrowly defined audience than a really broad one. And what you can do in this process to help you define your audience and really speak to that audience in an impactful and compelling way is to create an audience profile. So an audience profile is a really helpful tool, which basically allows you to have a clear picture of a fictional person who is your audience member. And you kind of summarize things like their demographic information, their psychographic information, things like their giving history and giving patterns if they're a donor, things like access to services, who else they may have used if it's a client, other information like how they like to communicate with your organization, what their daily life might be like, that sort of thing. Just giving you a clear kind of synopsis of who your donor is, which is really helpful. And there's a number of ways that you can find out this information. If you are looking for information about your audience online and your website is connected to Google Analytics, you can certainly use that to access a lot of great information about your online audience. There's another service similar to Google Analytics called Crazy Egg that will also allow you to access that sort of information. But by far, I think the most effective one is going directly to your audience to survey them. This is something I like to recommend my clients do on an annual basis. They kind of bake it into their program or fundraising calendars. And they make it a point to talk to the people who, are their audience. So they ask things like qualitative and quantitative questions to get a sense for their audience and see if they can try to find and identify the trends that make the audience unique and the things that are really resonating with them about that organization. This is a really cool process. I personally really enjoy it, and I think it really enhances your ability to speak to that audience much more effectively. All right, so moving right along here, the third step in this process is to kind of start to move into figuring out who your character and your conflict are. And I like to think about this as how we build empathy with our audience. So choosing your character and your conflict ahead of time before going out and trying to find the story is a useful way to kind of use it as a filter. So you can more directly ask staff or colleagues for specific stories because you know what you have in mind already, which can be very helpful. I'll talk about that a bit more. So character is a really important aspect of our stories because it is the human element that really adds a level of humanization to your organization for your audience. These are, the people that your donors help, perhaps, maybe other clients who might be similar to clients who are accessing a program, things like that. It kind of depends on the context in which you're telling your story. But I like to think of about 6 pretty common characters. So clients, staff members, board members, volunteers, your donors, Also, community advocates can make for really great characters and stories as well. And the reason why I like to think about kind of these segments of characters is to make sure that when I'm doing storytelling as kind of a full year-long effort, or maybe a shorter 1 or 2 month campaign, that we get kind of a variety of voices and perspectives from the stories. So that it's not just all client stories, but there's other stories as well that might resonate with other members of our audience. And then the other side of the coin to this is conflict. Personally, this is one of my favorite aspects about storytelling. I think it is such an important thing that oftentimes we don't think a lot about. Conflict is really what drives our stories forward, and it's also the variable that makes your donor feel like even more of a hero. And it can be the emotional pull of your story that will get your audience to care and to really stay interested right to the end. So I would encourage you to really think about what your character's conflict might be in the story that you're interested in telling. There's a lot of different conflicts, probably too many to name really, but things like a struggle that they've had, maybe an internal struggle or an external struggle. You can also think about things like your organization's importance in the community. So if you're talking about maybe a staff member story or a board member, talk about why that person felt called to start working there, volunteering there, and maybe what their life was like before they started, things like that. So there's lots of different ways that you can slice and dice your conflict. And just to give you a better idea of the power that character and conflict hold for a potential reader, I want to tell you about something that happened to me recently. So one of my clients is Cancer Care Connection, and they're based out in Delaware, and they provide a social work model to support people who are affected by cancer. And they do this through kind of coaching and counseling and resource referrals, that sort of thing. And basically everything except medical care for cancer. Now, I haven't personally been affected by cancer, and I feel very fortunate that that's been the case. So when I first started working with them and I was working on their case for support, I felt like I didn't have an immediate connection to the experience of having a loved one be affected by cancer. But that changed for me a couple months ago. I was visiting them, and I had a chance to sit down with one of their cancer resource coaches, Kathy. And I had asked her, why are people calling your 800 number these days? What are kind of some common requests that you're hearing and trouble that people are having? And she said that one of the calls she'd been receiving quite a bit in the last couple months was from adult children who had had a parent who had been diagnosed with cancer. And that parent had either elected to have different treatment, or they had been considering entering a hospice and looking at end-of-life care. And the child was calling Cancer Care Connection because they were having a really hard time accepting that choice, and they wanted their parent to fight the fight and not give up, and they were feeling kind of the sense of hopelessness about the situation, and helplessness as well. So it was really interesting. I'm sitting there in her office listening to this story. She's telling me about one in particular. And as she was telling me this, I started to kind of feel goosebumps all over me. And that was because I know this feeling in a different context in my life. I totally know the conflict that child is going through when they pick up the phone and decide to call Cancer Care Connection. My mom has multiple sclerosis, and when she decided to stop treatment probably about 7 or 8 years ago now, I had a really hard time accepting her choice, as did a number of my family members. We wanted her to take good care of herself, to increase her quality of life, and to have the best chance possible to still have her mobility as she moved into her 50s and 60s. So I totally understood this sense of helplessness that child has when they call Cancer Care Connection, even though it was in a completely different context compared to why they were calling. So the reason why I'm telling you this is that this is what it might be like for some of your donors or some of your audience members. They may not have a direct connection to your mission or your vision. They may not have ever accessed your services, and they may not ever. But chances are they probably have had an experience in their life which allows them to relate to your organization's mission and the experience of people who are accessing the work that you do. So just an example to show you, and I hope that kind of communicates that point a little bit more for you about how character and conflict can play such an important role in storytelling. I really think it's one of the most important pieces of our stories. So I want to shift gears a little bit into our fourth step in this process, which is all about collecting the stories. And this is something I hear from folks they have the most trouble with is, how do I work collaboratively with my colleagues to get stories? If you're in communications, maybe you're in marketing, maybe you're a board member, and you're not sure, how to access those stories. So this is where everything really starts to converge, where you really bring together the character, the conflict, your audience to start getting the stories that you need and being able to share those with your donors. So I always find it's helpful to, as I said, work with colleagues, but all too often what I see happen is people will go to, a program coordinator or a program manager, and they'll say, tell me a story. I need a story for the upcoming newsletter. And the problem with this is that it's really, really broad. And when you kind of give someone an open-ended question like that, tell me a story, oftentimes it can feel really overwhelming. So it's important to be specific and to help facilitate this process of storytelling, especially if people don't really identify themselves as being storytellers or having stories to tell. So just as an example for you here on this slide, I've given you an example of how I once asked a colleague for a story. So I said, I'm writing our donor stewardship report, and I wanted to be able to share a story about someone from a program. And I gave them the program name. And then I said, ideally, someone who's had a positive experience in this program and that you think has really benefited from it. Do you have any thoughts about people who might be good to speak to? So again, this is really telling them, where I want to use this story, the specific person whose story I'm looking for. So a client who's gone through a specific program and someone who's had a good experience. So I've given them a few more parameters to think about. And then ask them, do you have any people who you think might be good for me to talk to? So asking them for leads that they can connect me to or pass along to help collect that story. So another thing you can do to make that process easier as well is to think about developing a storytelling toolkit and creating tools and systems that you can put in place for collecting stories. One of the ones that I think is really great is to be able to create a story collection form. And this can be either an online form. You could use something like Google Forms or Woohoo Forms, online form services. Or you can create just a paper one that you can give to your colleagues. And basically, this is a place where they can submit story leads. So anytime they've come across a client or a donor or maybe someone else out in the community who's told them something really interesting about their connection to your organization, you can consider asking that. You can consider creating the story collection form and having them put their stories there directly. And one way that you can kind of keep this top of mind for people is to send out a monthly email. So I worked with an organization a number of years ago that did this as well. They would send out an internal monthly staff newsletter, and to kind of build camaraderie among people, they would include 2 stories that had been shared by staff members the previous month, and they would, of course, credit who had shared them. And they would also remind people, these are the stories that we're looking for upcoming communications, for events, things like that. And here's where you can put those stories. So here's a link to our story collection form. Again, this is just a way to stay top of mind for people. Storytelling does take effort. It takes facilitation, that's for sure. And it's really important to be able to facilitate that for people through things like that. So I just saw a question there from someone who asked if we'll be sending out a copy of the presentation with the email addresses that you registered with. And I believe the answer is yes, and you should also be receiving a recording as well, but Jenny can confirm that for us at the end of the webinar. So we'll just move into the last section of this process, which is about sharing your stories. And this is really dealing with more of the mediums and the how of communicating those stories to our people. So this is where I think it gets really fun. And this is where I think it's really useful to create a story strategy, to really develop a plan for how you're going to share that story with your target audience to meet the goals that you've specified. And if you're in fundraising and communications, I like to think of this as kind of an extension of those plans. So this is a really way to complement what you're doing And this is how I like to break it down. I like to think about these 3 questions. First, what are your funding priorities? Second, how will you be communicating with and soliciting your donors? And finally, in relation to your answers to the first 2 questions, what opportunities do you have for storytelling? And that last question is a really important one. This is where you can brainstorm to your heart's content. Write down all of the ways that you communicate and solicit donors in campaigns. How can you communicate with them differently? Look at your survey results. Think about where your audience is most often communicating with you at, whether it's email, social media, your website, things like that. And think about how you can infuse stories more often into the touch points where your audience already is going. That's a really important one to consider. Now, because I'm a bit of a visual thinker, I like to organize all this information in kind of an Excel sheet or a table. And so this is a template, or part of it anyways, that I often use. Apologies there, I see the formatting on the second column title is a bit funky. But anyways, I like to put the months down the first column, and then across the side there, I like to first write down what campaigns or funding priorities are happening that month, and then any fundraising tactics that we're using. So email, direct mail, video, events, whatever that might be. And then I like to think about donor stewardship as well, because I think that's another important category. And finally, anything that doesn't really fit into those 2. So maybe marketing, maybe client work, whatever that might be. And really listing out all of the opportunities, the mediums that you have to tell those stories. And then what you can do, if you add another column or 2, you can write in what kind of stories you want to tell. So what character and what conflict. And then also make a notation of the timeline that you have for collecting that story. So when do you need it by, and who do you need to talk to? So again, this is just a really great way to intentionally organize your information. And I find that when you create a plan for yourself, it's really much easier to stay on top of storytelling and to regularly collect and tell stories to your audience. So as we wrap up here before we get to our Q&A, I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts about storytelling in relation to organizations. And the fact that I really do believe that storytelling can transform your nonprofit, whether it's increasing your revenue, building better relationships, or just increasing overall awareness in the community about your cause. So one of the really amazing things that I've seen emerge in the research I've been doing and the work I've done in the last couple of years is that nonprofits who tell a lot of great stories have a lot of organizational cultural similarities. Chief among them is that they are organizations where staff members really value interpersonal connection and vulnerability, and above all, they value each other. They see everyone as an important member of the team, all doing great work and all headed in the same direction towards the mission. So this is a really interesting phenomenon to me to kind of see emerge because, staff members kind of naturally go about their work. They're naturally engaged with storytelling because they're feeling connected to their coworkers and their colleagues. So let me explain this a bit more. So quite often what happens on the contrary of this is that there are often a lot of silos at nonprofit organizations, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, whether it's between departments, teams, people, whatever it might be. The truth is that these silos are extremely counterproductive to our work on the whole. But interestingly, I think we can break them down through storytelling, because as we tell each other stories, we practice empathy, we practice listening, and above all, we practice care for each other. And I think that this is what really helps build relationships with coworkers that leads to better collaboration and, a much deeper sense of fulfillment from our work, which is a pretty powerful thing to stay connected with. We all have the great benefit of working in a sector that does great work. We all feel passionate about our work, but it's sometimes hard to connect with that. We get bogged down in to-do lists and items every day that need to get checked off and emails that need to be responded to. But sometimes when we take a step back and we really connect with our bigger why and our purpose for being there, we can tap into that better sense of fulfillment in our work. So the final thought I'll just leave you here with is that the most important stories that you tell are the ones that you tell yourself and the ones that you tell to each other. And I would really encourage you to not underestimate the power of the simple yet profound act of telling your coworkers' stories and also connecting to the story of why you do the work that you do. I think this really helps to plant the seeds for an amazing storytelling organization. And with that, I know we have about 15 minutes left here, and I'd love to be able to answer any questions that we have from today's webinar.
Great. We have some great questions coming in, Vanessa, so let's go ahead and dive in. To start kind of where we left off, just to kind of drive those points home, we have a couple questions about the story collection form that you showed us.
Sure.
Do you have any additional resources to point people to, anyone completed that they could use as a template, and also a specific question about what donor stewardship means in your Excel chart that you showed?
Sure. So in terms of the story collection form, I have a sample that I can send you, Jenny, that we can send out to everyone.
Absolutely.
Just as a sample. I should have included that on one of the slides. But yeah, so usually just to give you an idea of what I include in that, I include usually a field for someone's name, so the person who's submitting it. Also, their email address in case I need to get a hold of them, and their telephone number if they are at a satellite office or they're not in an office where I see them every day. And then I ask, whose story are you submitting? So the name of the person. And then usually it's great to ask them, would this person prefer to remain confidential, just so I can know offhand. And then I ask them to tell me a little bit about this person and their relationship with the organization, and tell me a bit about the story that's there and why the person who's submitting the story thinks it's a great one to share with other people, getting to a little bit more of the heart of why that story matters. And usually the last question I like to ask on there is it okay if I follow up with that person or with you for an interview to ask some more questions about it and to dig a little bit further? So, keeping it short and sweet is important, and I will definitely share the template that I have. I'll send that over to you this afternoon, Jenny, for everyone to see. And I think your other question there on the Excel was about donor stewardship. So there were fields for fundraising tactics and things like that. And donor stewardship, I take that to mean, anything you might be doing to steward your donors. So whether it is, sending out a report, putting together a thank you video, maybe you're hosting an open house and you'd like a speaker there. So they're just, I like to separate that out from fundraising because I do think it's a little bit special. We're not telling the story to raise money. We're telling it to connect our donors a little bit further to the organization. And that's why it has a separate column there.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm having a couple questions come in about other ways to share stories other than writing. Some people might be intimidated to write a long testimonial, what have you. How do you feel about videos or a photo collage or something like that?
Yeah, so there are tons of really creative and interesting ways to share stories. I actually just did an interview with North York Community House on my blog last week or the week before. They actually have an entire program that they work with clients on digital storytelling as part of kind of a narrative therapy. And they do that through audio and through video and through collage, which I think is pretty fabulous. There are tons of ways to tell your stories and also to collect them. And I think one of the great things about, our day and age is that pretty much everyone has a smartphone, and at least a lot of your staff will, maybe not your clients, but most of your staff will. And almost all smartphones have a video camera feature. And a lot of them, of course, have cameras as well to take pictures. So there are a lot of great ways to use video and pictures. In fact, I think it was Capulet Communications had done a study a couple of years ago about, what were the posts on Facebook that got like the highest engagement rates. And it was almost consistently always photos of staff doing things around the office with a caption about what was going on behind the scenes, which is another type of storytelling. So you can look for opportunities to kind of combine mediums. So if you're doing storytelling on social media, a lot of times there's an opportunity for a caption. Or if you have a picture that's just really powerful, you can let that speak for itself, which is great as well. I got an email from, I think it was the UNICEF USA Fund a couple weeks ago, and they had the subject line was something like your impact in 16 photos. And it was a Facebook photo album that they had put together with short one-sentence captions that told me all about a specific project. And the 16 photos was kind of the story arc, and it took me through the day in the life of two kids that they were helping in a specific village, which was really great. It was a pretty creative way to provide stewardship to a donor and also to use storytelling in that process as well.
Excellent. There's also some questions about how best to survey or interview people to get these stories. Is there an example of questions that they might use to profile their audience directly, or just a way to kind of get that out of them without being intimidating?
Is that interviewing the client for a story, or interviewing their audience for their audience profile?
The client for a story.
Okay, great. So interviewing, I know, can definitely be a tough thing for a lot of folks. I remember last year at one of my workshops that I was teaching, that was a big topic of discussion, was that a few people had not had good experiences interviewing their organization's clients, and they wanted to get better at it. So there are a number of tips and tricks I can tell you just from interviews that I've done myself with a number of people for stories. I always like to, if possible, and if the person feels comfortable, just record the interview on my phone. So I focus on just having a conversation with that person and talking to them, rather than having to sit there and scribble and take notes and not be fully engaged in the conversation. And that's the second thing I would say about this, is that, you can really remove the idea of it being an interview and think of it just as being a conversation, which it is. You are getting to know the person across from you at the coffee shop, across from you at the table in your office, wherever it might be. Your whole goal is to get to know them better and to be a friend and listen to what they have to say. So the more you can practice listening skills in that conversation, and just be curious and ask them questions. And, at the beginning of an interview, I always like to let people know, I have questions about, your experience before you access the service or whatever it might be. And, if at any time one of these questions doesn't feel comfortable to you, or you're not ready to answer it, that's totally okay. You can tell me, I don't feel comfortable answering that, and we'll move on. It's totally in your power to veto questions. And I think just letting people know that they are empowered in this situation can be really helpful, because a lot of times, they may feel like they have to answer every question you're going to give them, which is not the case at all. So you can just let them know, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. And sometimes, after an interview that I've done with someone, maybe it'll be 20 minutes, maybe it'll be an hour. I may go back and I may work on a story, and I might have questions that come up again. I may be like, oh, they said this thing that was really interesting, and, I have a couple more questions. So I may follow up with them again at some point just to get a bit more information. If it's a traditional kind of client story, you're really going to focus on the before and after. So I like to think about this as, what was the big problem that they were facing in their life? So I'll give you an example. Someone who had a drug addiction, for instance. Their big struggle was that they had an addiction issue. And what was the implication of that? What was kind of the external conflict for them? Was that, it was preventing them from holding down a job. Maybe it was preventing them from having stable housing somewhere. But they were really trapped in this cycle, and they were just not feeling ready to commit to a recovery program. But one day they decided to. Something clicked for them, and there's an event that happens in their life that's a turning point. And that's kind of the external conflict that we can tell. And then, in that story, the organization gets introduced at that point. But then once they get into that recovery program, there's also another interesting story we can tell as well, which is, what was it like being in the recovery program? What was your experience there? Did you struggle at all? Did you find it challenging at some times? Were you ready to quit? And talk about the internal conflicts that they faced with themselves once they decided to make that change. So that's a formula that you can apply to a number of stories, is thinking about kind of the internal and external conflict, which is, I guess, kind of like the before and after. And I like to ask a lot of questions around that, because that's really where the real story and the real emotion will exist.
Excellent. I think we have time for probably one more question here. I apologize to all those that we haven't gotten to. We will follow up with you. Somebody works specifically for an animal rescue organization. I think this can apply to a lot of organizations that do similar work to others. They're asking how can they differentiate their stories from organizations doing similar work, especially if it has to do with pictures of cute cats or children. What is the way to stand out?
That's an excellent question. I get asked that quite a bit, which is, how can we just in general stand out in the marketplace when there's a lot of organizations out there doing similar work? So the first thing I would suggest is really figure out what makes your organization unique. So in the landscape of other animal shelters, children's organizations, what are you doing that's really special compared to all of them, and how can you amplify that uniqueness through the stories that you tell? And then another thing you can do is look at your competition, look at the other organizations that are doing similar work, and take a look at their stories if they have any, and think about how they're presenting their stories, what forms they're doing it in, and think about how you might do that differently. So maybe they're only presenting stories on their website that are written. And maybe you've decided that you want to do some videos, maybe interviews with people who have adopted pets from your shelter, that sort of thing. So I think it's a bit of a combination of figuring out, what uniquenesses you want to highlight, and ultimately those are up to you. Your organization's work best, and you can really speak to kind of the unique attributes of your work, maybe how you provide the service, maybe how you were founded, whatever that might be. And then being able to tell those stories in a slightly different way, but in a way that's still engaging and relevant for your audience. I hope that answers that question. That's one I feel like I could give a much longer answer to, but I know we're short on time here today.
I think that's a great start. It may be one that you can even elaborate on in a blog post following up.
Yeah,
one more quick question.
Sure.
How do you gauge the length and the tone of a story based upon the medium through which you're going to tell it? A newsletter versus an email blast versus something with your funder. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I can just give you my quick high-level thoughts on that. So for email, I usually like to keep a story under 500 words. With email, people are scrolling through it quick. A lot of people are reading on tablets or smartphones, so it takes longer for them to get to the bottom of it. So we want to keep it brief, and if possible, we can tell them the compelling, interesting pieces of that story and then send them somewhere else to see the rest of it, maybe to watch a video or to read more about it on your website, something like that. Social media, every channel has its own constraints, whether it's 140 characters or 6 seconds or video, things like that. So that's definitely a constraint that you have to work with. For video, I think kind of the ideal time is somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes. When it gets longer than 5 minutes, you start to get drop off unless it's a really excellent story that people are excited to watch the full thing of. In terms of funder reports, that's a really good question as well. Funders really do like to hear about their impact. They want to hear the stories. I tend to go a little bit longer with those, as I also would do with a major donor stewardship report or something like that. The story, I would usually aim to be somewhere between a full page to 2 pages, but they may have specific requirements around the length that you may need to work with. So always look into those as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Vanessa, for taking the time to be here today. We really appreciate it. I know I personally learned a lot, and I hope all of you on the phone did as well. For everybody who's joining us, thanks for taking the time to be here today. Keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars at guidestar.org/webinars. And again, if we didn't get to your question, please check our blog at trust.guidestar.org for additional answers soon. And we'll also be sending out an email with the presentation, the recording, the template that Vanessa is going to send me. So keep an eye out for that probably early next week. Thank you all so much again, and have a great day.